I want to talk today about Oroonoko, the novel or novella, short-ish novel, long-ish narrative, written by Aphra Behn, the English writer that we looked at some poetry of hers the other day. And here we have probably her greatest legacy today. She was primarily and prolifically a playwright of her own day, but not a lot of that stuff really lives on culturally. There aren't a lot of productions of her theatrical efforts in the world today. Some occasionally, The Rover especially, but it's not she's not really Shakespeare. But this novel has gotten a lot of attention for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that she is a woman author, and that's notable in history. There are all too few representatives of that that still have a presence in our culture. Some of that is just the fact that men had the freedom and the means to sit down and write, whereas women were always kind of kept busy and discouraged from it. Women were also blocked from education and all sorts of stuff. So to become a writer as a woman was a remarkable phenomena. But the novel as a form started to change that. The novel as a form started to open up opportunities. The seriousness of poetry and the deep learnedness of poetry gave men a distinct advantage as authors. But prose narrative is more informal. Prose narrative is less dependent on your education. You don't have to know the ancient Greek epics in order to write a story. It can help, but it's not essential. Whereas in the poetry of the day, deep familiarity with the poetic forms going back 2,000-3,000 years was kind of assumed. This gives the novel in its early incarnations a kind of particular character as forms go. Now, the novel is a hotly debated field of inquiry in terms of when it began, what was the first novel, what is its real history, what is its real inheritance. And this is all a very academic discussion. Certainly long prose narratives had been in existence for quite some time. I can point to a couple, just 600 years earlier, you get a really substantive narrative in the Tale of Genji from Japan, 600 years earlier, not exactly short. Also by a woman writer, notably. But in Aphra Behn's own time, it was becoming more and more commonplace with the advent of the printing press, mass production of books, and mass consumption of books across a growing middle class who had a little time on their hands, especially women readers of not necessarily the upper class, but the certainly a comfortable middle class. They would have a servant or two around the house to do all of the drudgery work, and they were, as housewives, they were expected to monitor all of that work, but they would have considerable downtime while, monitoring somebody else doing all the actual work. And so you get a proliferation of prose narratives coming about with this new rising middle class in the world of modern capitalism, essentially. And you get a number of superstar writers in this era working in this format, which is largely popular entertainment. It was essentially the TV of its day. You get authors like Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe was a contemporary. Another woman writer, Madame de Lafayette, La Princesse de Cleves. Relatively short narratives focused on a variety of concerns, but primarily appealing to a middle-class sensibility. So you get people like Madame de Lafayette writing largely about a woman's perspective in a domestic sphere. Very unusual for its time, but this is feeding that demographic that is buying these books. But also in that, when people are sitting in their little living rooms or their parlors or whatever you want to call them, and reading, they don't always want to read about stuff that is their own concern or their own familiar territory of the domestic life. They also like tales of far away, escapism. And so you get stuff like Robinson Crusoe, which is a story of shipwreck far away and exotic locales and surviving against all odds and extraordinary circumstances. So these parallel impulses in the early novel of realism of a sort and escapism of a sort are really wrestling it out for a new kind of expression in this new medium. Every new medium discovers its own parameters, discovers its own rules, and the medium itself, the novel in this case, is a product of some very unique social factors, some very explicit market-driven demands. The strangeness of the form itself gives a kind of inventiveness quality to it. There is a sense that, well, okay, we're making up the rules, so you can do all sorts of things, and that can make it seem a little confusing at times. I can see many of you, I'm sure, are, but if you can look past that, as a modern reader, you need to strip away all of the comfortable assumptions of, well, that's just poorly written, or that person obviously doesn't know how novels are done, and all of that. Well, yeah, because they're kind of making it up as they go along. And if we can get to a point where that is accepted and move past that and just say, all right, they're kind of speaking in a foreign language and they haven't really got all the idioms down just yet, if we can grant them that latitude, these books, that kind of freedom to experiment, then it's really exciting just to see how this new form of expression is being born. And Oroonoko gives us an awful lot of that. Aphra Behn is a experimental writer. I think we can all agree. She's doing all sorts of things that are a little bit confusing sometimes, and she's being a little clunky from time to time. The story is very episodic. One thing happens and then another thing happens, and it's not always clear the through line. There is a big shift in the middle of it, right in the middle of it, where you change locales, and it seems to be an entirely different story at that point. The way dialogue is communicated is also a little bit confusing. The speaker tags, where you get he said or she said or something like that in there, those can be very difficult to follow. They're very variable in the way she uses them. Some of them are included in parentheses, and it's just strange. There is an italicization of there in there. There is random capitalization, which the English love in there. The Americans tend to love it too, I gotta tell you. There are some very indistinct pronoun references. So when you come across, the word he or him or he or she or hit or hers or something like that, it's not always clear who it's referring to, and not in often not in the kind of clever modernist way of trying to destabilize that. It's just, I think, a little bit poorly written at certain points. And also, there are really explicit attempts to clarify or legitimize the narrator in a way that most modern fiction will just take for granted. Some of the quirks of the perspective, of the point of view of the narrator, are kind of ham-fistedly put out there, and it strains credulity from time to time, to say the least. The final product, however, is ultimately, I would say, very readable, very interesting, and very indicative of the age that is engendering it. You get, here we are in the waning days of the Restoration and the early days of the Enlightenment, and you can see an awful lot of the characteristics of both eras in here, with a clear orientation towards where literature and art is going. There is a effort in the Enlightenment range to teach. There is a focus on self-improvement, on making a better world, on finding the God-given perfection in all of us on Earth that will ultimately lead to the impulse in the later Enlightenment to say, well, what do we really need God for anyway? But that's down the line. This is very early, and I'm not trying to suggest anything particularly sacrilegious in Aphra Behn. But you do see a lot of the characteristics of some of her poetry in there. Some of the poetry that we saw, where she is very concerned with the characterization of females, the limitations that society places upon women, the censoriousness with which society tends to look at pleasure generally and women's pleasure specifically. And so this story tries to trouble that a little bit, just tries to make it a little bit stranger for readers to conceive, so that when they're reading it from the comfortable confines of their, cozy little armchair at the end of a long day, they can read about all these people and say, oh, well, those people are just terrible. That's silly. The way they have constructed their society is just awful. Those rules and all that, that's just silly. But in the back of their head, they might be thinking, oh, well, but it sounds familiar. Maybe we can be indicted for the same thing? Maybe this isn't just about those people, but rather those people are being used as a representation of us. That's troubling. But all of those thoughts are packaged in this very commercial product, and it is a largely commercial product. Some of the most popular writings of the day were memoirs or stuff that purported to be memoirs, and here Aphra Behn kind of rides that duality a little bit. You know, sure, this is all true. I saw it, or at least I heard it, or I heard it secondhand, or third hand, or, you know, I'm making this up. That is a very popular genre. The travel narratives, as I suggested, are a very popular genre, particularly about the new hot topic ripped from the headlines, which is exploration in the so-called New World. This was the thing that was selling. Anybody who could report anything, say anything about the New World, they had an automatic audience. And to a degree, Aphra Behn was in a unique situation there where she had actually traveled there. The fuzzy details of her biography are a little untrustworthy, and we're not going to lean on them terribly heavily, but she did travel. Historians are fairly agreed that she did go to Suriname for a little while and got to see what was rising out of the jungle when they got there, and that is this colonial experiment and the institution, or the efforts to establish the institution of slavery. And she makes use of that experience, and she sells that to people who are curious about it. And through those very popular, commercial, and at times sensationalist superficialities, you get these other undercurrents that point to something more sophisticated going on here. And that's where I think Aphra Behn's significance today really lies.